We're going to start a John Bevan fan club. How's that? We'll get a bunch of groupies, follow them around. Well, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today and to introduce Dr. Bob Rosenthal. Dr. Rosenthal is the co-president of the Foundation of Inner Peace, the publisher of A Course in Miracles, having served on the Foundation's board of directors for almost 25 years. He was a close friend and protege of Bill Thetford, the co-scribe of A Course in Miracles. He was a board-certified psychiatrist and psychotherapist until retiring to take on this new position. Dr. Bob is the author of From Plagues to Miracles, the transformational journey of Exodus from slavery of the ego to the promised land of spirit, which reinterprets the biblical story of Moses and Pharaoh as a parable of the spiritual journey. His forthcoming book, From Never Mind to Ever Mind, Transforming the Self to Embrace Miracles, approaches the course from a fresh, new perspective and will be released in March. Is there advance sales going on?
Not yet. Still waiting to hear from my editors.
Okay. We'll tell them we're anxiously waiting.
All right.
So would everyone please welcome and give a big round of applause to Dr. Bob Rosenthal.
Thank you all. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yep.
Just move this up a little bit. So, some of you were here yesterday. For you guys, it's, as Yogi Berra said, deja vu all over again. Back for a second dose. Hair of the dog that bit you. On Sunday morning. So the title of today's message is Self-Conscious or Conscious of Self. And I guess the reason this came up was the last time I was here, which was right between Groundhog Day and Valentine's Day of 2016, I was just a psychiatrist in private practice in Pennington who got lucky enough to sell a book to Hay House. Now I'm the co-president of the Foundation for Inner Peace. Wow. And so clearly a lot more is going to be expected of me, and I wondered if standing up here I'd find that I was self-conscious. And I started thinking, well, what does that really mean, self-conscious? I mean, you know, what are those moments where we find ourselves feeling self-conscious? They're usually, no, I will say they're always a sudden hyper-awareness of ourself, small s self, due to some exposure, embarrassment, or untoward revelation. For us guys, you discover your fly is down, or you've got a little piece of, crumb in your beard. For the ladies, maybe it's the toilet paper hanging off the back of your dress. Or it's that joke you tell that nobody laughs at, and the room is dead quiet. In other words, there's an expectation of appearing in a certain way that hits a very hard wall and a very hard limit. And in that moment, we feel exposed, we feel embarrassed, we feel ashamed. We feel the emotion that I studied in school and worked with in my therapy practice for 3 decades, that emotion known as shame. To really get at shame, I think we need to look at, all right, so in that moment of self-consciousness, not self-awareness, self-consciousness, what is this self that got, exposed? What is the self that slipped out and that we're like, get back there? Well, from some of the examples I gave, you can probably tell already, this self is very much identified with the physical body. Great example. Has anyone ever farted in a public place? Darn body, oh my God. Or sat in a very serious prayer meeting or lecture and your stomach is rumbling. So this is the sense that our body is somehow betraying us, it's out of control, it's embarrassing. We don't like this self that's associated with the body. And however much we may try to dress it up and put on, nice clothing and hats and do our hair, if you just look at the body in a mirror, I mean, unless you're about 21 years old and have no idea what's in store for you, it doesn't look all that great. What else gets exposed? What other things make us self-conscious? Well, performance-based. When we have an expectation of how we are supposed to perform in a given setting, and we fail that expectation, or we think we fail that expectation, then we feel some embarrassment. We feel self-conscious. If I started stumbling over my words and, and like, wait a minute, what did I write here? I can't read this thing. I might feel embarrassed. I might feel like I'm letting you guys down, and perhaps more important, not living up to a self-image, a self-concept that I have of myself. So notice, in performance, and in our focus on performance, and by the way, that's not just, something like this. That's as simple as you meet someone and you forget to shake their hand or give a hug. You don't remember their name and they remember your name. Has that ever happened to anyone? So in this performance that we fail, there's judgment. We are judging ourselves, and we are judging ourselves along the lines of what we anticipate or believe someone else might be thinking about us. In other words, we're sort of climbing into someone else's shoes, looking at ourselves and going, yuck. We all know what the Course says about judgment. I mean, it's one of the favorite tools of the ego. And notice in that sort of algorithm, that equation in which we imagine ourselves as someone else would see us and disapprove of that, there is profound separation. We're not looking at them and seeing them as one with us in love or anything close to it. We see them as separate. We see them as judgmental. Of course, we're judging them as judgmental, so the judgment also rests with us. And this thing can ping-pong back and forth many, many times. All judgment is based on the past. So when we look at performance, we are also necessarily bringing in the whole range of our past experience. Well, how did I do the last time I stood up here? Wow, I think I did really well. I really loved that Valentine's Groundhog Day talk I did. I think it was one of my best. There's no way I'm going to live up to that today. No way. So don't expect instant enlightenment during or after this talk or this afternoon's workshop. Okay? Now, if it happens, because it can, then wouldn't that be lovely? If you walk out of here this afternoon or later today feeling the light of God, feeling love, feeling a glow that is either unaccustomed or perhaps that you've tasted and touched in moments, well, wouldn't that be lovely? And that's my hope for today. But in the meantime, we've got these moments of exposure, moments of self-consciousness. What is going on all the rest of the time when we're not exposed as self-conscious? Who is the self that God exposed, and what's it doing the rest of the time? And what I'm going to suggest here is that self that gets exposed in those moments is there the entire time, that is in fact the ego self, excuse me, and that the ego, in its very nature, is inherently shame-bound. Now, A Course in Miracles talks a great deal about guilt. If you're a student of the Course, you can probably cite chapter and verse and know that we felt guilty for leaving God and, feel like we killed God and therefore God's going to kill us. But the Course only talks about shame specifically. I think there are about 5 mentions. I recently wrote about this for the Miracle Distribution Center's newsletter, Holy Encounter, and I think it's an important point. There's a reason why the Course doesn't mention shame. It's because Helen Schuckman and Bill Thetford were psychoanalytically trained And in psychoanalysis of the 1960s and 1970s, shame had not yet been recognized as an emotion, and an emotion that required therapeutic treatment. There were very few papers written on it. Whereas guilt, Freud had a field day with guilt. There were thousands of papers written on guilt. So this isn't the fault of Helen and Bill's. It isn't the fault of Jesus's. It's basically that when Jesus came through Helen and spoke to her internally, she didn't have the vocabulary. She didn't have the paradigm to look at shame. So I want to just offer some clinical tidbits on shame because the ego is shame-bound, and it goes through it spends a lot of energy trying to hide that. And I think a big part of what A Course in Miracles is trying to help us do, and good psychotherapy as well, by the way, is to look at that within us which we have deemed shameful, which we try to hide from others, which we try to hide from ourselves, and expose it to the light of awareness and ultimately to the light of love and God, where it evaporates, where it is no more. So shame and guilt. Well, what's the difference? They feel pretty much identical, don't they? Yes and no. As I learned it, guilt is a response to an action that we took that we later regret, or that caused harm, or that backfired in some way. I did something, I feel guilty, and therefore guilt has a profound learning potential. Guilt says, oh, I did it, I'm not going to do that again. I really, that was a screw up. I feel really bad about it. And what I like about that is we can change as a result of guilt. Guilt is a teaching tool. Shame, on the other hand, isn't about what we do. Shame is about what we are, or what we think we are, what we've been taught we are. And so shame doesn't really have the same learning value. The nature of shame is to hide itself. Even in the body's reaction, when we feel ashamed, there's this, notice, you turn your head down, your eyes go away, you don't want to look out, you don't want to make eye contact. You don't want to see, but more importantly, you don't want to be seen. There is a cutoff of the connectivity with all of the people that you love and know, and those that you don't. So the ego, in pulling itself away from God in its mind and entering sort of a very nasty little dream in which we all most of the time find ourselves, the ego made a self-concept that is by definition lacking. If you come from allness and everything, then no matter what you make, it's going to fail the test of allness and everything. It can't possibly be as good as God. And therefore, we go about in our little bodies and in our little worlds and our personalities. We do the best we can to be upstanding citizens and likable, but inherently we are carrying the ego's shame to the extent that we identify with the ego. I will spare you the lecture on how the ways that we manage shame, except to say that, as the Course says, we try to offload it. We project it out. We attack someone else and make them feel bad so they've got the shame and we don't. I don't know if any of you watch the news these days, but that is happening in some respects with certain political figures. We also try to avoid our internal sense of shame, and we avoid it by sort of propping ourselves up by a grandiose sense of self, as the Course talks about. And usually that's accomplished through money, through sexual conquests, through fame, and again, we've got someone in the news who actually uses all three, which is a very rare finding. There's a Buddhist saying, the bigger the front, the bigger the back. In other words, the more you're seeing up front, the more it's hiding behind it. It's about shame, but it also tells you something when someone has to proclaim very loudly and vociferously about what they are and what they aren't. You know, behind there, yeah, there's a little kid who isn't feeling terribly good about him or herself. So what's the alternative? Well, let's go to, instead of self-conscious, conscious of self. What would that mean, conscious of self? Right away, we've taken apart the self-consciousness and looked at that there is a self, and we are simply working to be aware of that self. Now, this can occur in two different ways. So on the one hand, we can, with some observer mind, step back and become conscious of all of those little subroutines and ruses and defenses that we use to try to get through life. And we become conscious of them, not to necessarily improve ourselves, change them, come up with a better ruse or subroutine that'll fool more people. No, we become conscious of them. We go insightful in order to recognize this need not be. You know, this comes from a past that no longer exists, and we actually have an option. We have a choice. We can choose once again how we want to see ourselves. And rather than projecting our self-image out and wondering, well, how does she see me? How does he see me? We can ask, well, how does God see me? How does the Christ mind see me? And the answer is the only possible way the Christ mind and God can see you is as pure love, as oneness, because there is nothing else to that level of mind. Now, to a self, capital S, that is oneness, love, peace, and nothing but knowledge, capital K, could there be any shame? There really can't be, because there's no falling off, there's no limit. You know, that self is completely limitless. It can't be in shame, it can't be in guilt, because it can't do anything wrong. There is nothing to do, there's no body to do anything with. There's just absolute being and the light of love. That is consciousness of self. Is this self a solo identity? You know, there are in India, you know, sannyasin who just sit and, you know, and go into that oneness, that samadhi space. Is that self just, you know, out there and we enter it one by one? A Course in Miracles tells us no, that the best way to approach and apprehend that capital S sense of self is to see it in our brothers. And that by seeing it in our brothers, and I will add sisters, because after all, you know, this is 2017, not 1966, during the scribing of the Course. If we see it in our brothers and sisters, we have to see it in ourselves. And in a way, we are undoing that pernicious cycle by which we assume someone else is different than we are. We try to get into their head and look at us and make an adjustment about who we think we are. You know, there's a section of the text called Sin is an Adjustment, which talks all about any adjustment is basically, you know, testimony to your ego self. We undo that cycle by saying, I see self, capital S, everywhere, in every mind I look at. The body, it's just a thin veil over that mind. It's the same mind in you and you and you and you and you and you and me. That's all there is. And if we recognize God in everyone, well, there's no shame, there's no guilt, and we return to the oneness that is, I would call it our birthright, only it has nothing to do with birth. Our creation right. It is the essence of who we are. We are nothing else. So, next time you feel self-conscious, perhaps you can use that as a springboard, an opportunity to go, I know what this is. This is shame. And I can embrace it, notice it, watch it and make a different choice, and instead of feeling self-conscious, I can choose to be conscious of self. Thank you.